In this video, I'm going to be looking at that fascinating period of music in the UK between 1960 and 1963 via this amazing collection of Parlophone gold stereo LPs, and why this insignificant runt-of-the-company label was the most unlikely choice to change the world of popular music. Hi, I'm Andrew from Parlogram Auctions. Society and the music industry had been rocked by rock and roll in 1956, but by 1960 that threat seemed to be in retreat. Elvis was in the army, Buddy Holly was dead, and even the once mildly threatening Cliff Richard had one foot in the door of light entertainment. Parlophone had always been the poor relation at EMI, a dumping ground for acts that Norrie Paramore at Columbia and Norman Newell at HMV didn't want. It had become saddled with staid, adult-orientated music, just occasionally dipping its toe in the water of popular trends such as trad jazz and inoffensive pop music. These LPs illustrate not only how weak the Parlophone roster was during this time, but also just how little faith EMI had with the Beatles by putting them on this label. When I found this Parlophone leaflet inside an early copy of Please Please Me a few years ago, I decided to collect all of the 42 Parlophone stereo LPs listed on it. The leaflet dates from May 1963, literally a few weeks after the first stereo pressing of Please Please Me had hit the shops on the 26th of April, which was actually a full 5 weeks after the mono release. As every Beatles collector knows, the UK first gold stereo Parlophone pressing of Please Please Me is the rarest and most sought after of all their albums. But their first LP on this label actually marked the end of this beautiful gold label design. But before we get to that, let's go back to late 1960 and PCS 3001, the first Parlophone stereo LP. The honour of appearing on that first gold stereo label went to British comedy duo Flanders and Swann. They were lyricist, actor and singer Michael Flanders and composer, pianist Donald Swann. At the drop of a hat is a recording of their two-man show, with Flanders in a wheelchair as a result of polio, and Swann at the grand piano on an otherwise empty stage. The show consisted of a collection of witty songs, very much in the traditional English style, linked by topical comments. Tracks such as the GNU Song, the Song of Reproduction, and the Hippopotamus, aka Mud Glorious Mud, made the show very popular, so much so that it was revived in October 1963 as At the Drop of Another Hat. I love records from this period. These were not cheap, mass-produced tat for teenagers. Look at this thick, heavy card, with its beautiful deep gloss front panel. Stereo LPs from this period were very much aimed at a niche market. The kind of people who bought them were generally older, more affluent, and were of a type who tended to look after their records. I mean, look at this copy. It looks like it left the shops last week, let alone just over 60 years ago. It's interesting too to note that the front cover photograph was taken by Angus MacBean, the same man who a few years later would take the Please Please Me cover shot. Drab post-war Britain was fascinated by exotic, mysterious lands and with stories such as the Arabian Nights. PCS 3002 was the first of Parlophone's Music of the World series and promised to take you on a magic carpet to the realms of the romantic East, well, so it says here, and enticed you with this beautiful cover showing this pretty young lady who might be your guide. The reality, however, was a little different. Your guide was actually British composer and arranger Ron Goodwin, who entertained you with his interpretations of Lebanese folk music. We'll be accompanying Ron on his exotic travels again a little later on. PCS 3003 in November 1959 contained George Martin's second collaboration with Peter Sellers, the first being a 10-inch LP called The Best of Sellers 2 years earlier. The title was a spoof on Sinatra's Songs for Swinging Lovers and had a cover which may raise a few eyebrows these days. The LP is a virtuoso display of Sellers' outstanding vocal gifts and a wonderful example of the collaboration between his sense of humour and George Martin's production talents, and is without doubt one of the finest hours in both their careers. It's also notable for being singer Matt Monro's big break, as he sang uncredited as Fred Flange on the opening track You Keep Me Swinging. I've also got a mono test pressing of this album, which consists of these two one-sided LPs with special long-playing test record labels. They're both housed in these sturdy flip-back test pressing sleeves, reassuringly sealed by quality control. By the time this leaflet was printed in May 1963, PCS 3004, 3005 and 3006 had already been deleted. But here's what they were missing out on. PCS 3004 was the first of two LPs on Parlophone by the Glasgow Phoenix Choir. This one was titled Road to the Isles, and it looked like the kind of LP which would be ideal to give to your mum as a present, which is exactly what Tom and Jean did with this one at Christmas 1961. PCS 3005 is a tough one to find, as it was Parlophone's first attempt to cash in on the trad jazz boom of the late 1950s. The LP joined together Manchester band The Saints with South London's Mick Mulligan and his band cast as the Sinners, along with the self-proclaimed best half-Jewish Swiss blues singer in the world, George Melly, on vocals. PCS 3006 saw the return of Ron Goodwin and his masterly baton wielding. Always keen to keep up with the trends, Parlophone saw the fascination with the dawn of the space age as a chance to give people a taste of what interplanetary travel would be like. So Ron and his 40-piece orchestra took you on a journey with the deft skill of a painter, with a gigantic panorama of the universe as its canvas, it says here, to conjure up a fascinating and credible sound picture of an event which cannot be delayed. Sounds amazing, right? But like the Arabian Nights LP and many other albums of this type, the cover turned out to be better than the music. But although the music is poor, it's worth getting for the cover alone. PCS 3007 invited you to an evening of Scottish country dancing with already established Parlophone recording artist Jimmy Shand on his first stereo LP. Shand was a hard-working Scottish musician who played traditional Scottish music on his accordion. With more than 330 compositions to his name, he recorded more tracks than the Beatles and Elvis combined. In fact, at one point in the mid-1950s, he was releasing one single per month. He and George Martin recorded many albums together before Shand went into retirement in the early 1970s. PCS 3008 was yet another trip into the exotic, this time in the company of Pepe Jaramillo, a talented Mexican pianist, composer and arranger who won international fame after relocating to London in the late 1950s. His many recordings and worldwide concert appearances brought him international fame by expanding his repertoire from traditional Latin American songs to ones which included Broadway show tunes, music from movie soundtracks, and other popular songs of the day, all arranged to Latin American rhythms. Continuing to cater for its more mature audience, PCS 3009 in 1960 turned its attention to old-time music hall. For those, as it says here, which were old enough to remember the music halls before they had microphones, or remember paying 4p for your ticket and 2p for your glass of beer, and included great sing-along tracks such as Don't Dilly-Dally on the Way, Nellie Dean, Down at the Old Bull and Bush, amongst many others. The sleeve notes were written by Leonard Sachs, who compared the long-running BBC TV old-time music hall show called The Good Old Days, which ran from 1953 to 1983. One of Britain's biggest pop stars at the time was Adam Faith, and it was he who had the honour of having the first stereo pop LP on Parlophone, which was this, simply titled Adam. With John Barry at the helm, Adam phoned in a selection of standards and lame pop tunes, and although his singles did well, this LP wasn't a big seller, mainly because it was beyond the pocket of most teenagers, and pop was after all a singles-only market. Another early deletion, most likely due to licensing issues, was PCS 3011. In another effort to get into the trad jazz revival scene, Parlophone licensed Beware the Vikings Are All Over Us by Papa Boo's Viking Jazz Band from Storyville in Denmark. Arne Papa Boo Jensen was a Danish trombonist and bandleader who had formed the Viking Jazz Band in 1956. The group played Dixieland jazz, a style of music John Lennon was often quoted as hating. Not all Parlophone LPs were granted a stereo release, and the next one on the list, The Best of the Goon Shows No. 2, only went out in mono. But whereas together they weren't deemed worthy for the gold stereo treatment, their starman, Peter Sellers, definitely was. Peter Sellers and Sophia Loren made sweet music together on PCS 301 too, but unfortunately for Sellers, it was only on record. Goodness Gracious Me and Bangers and Mash were big hits off this album, and despite Sellers' enthusiasm, they didn't record or do anything else together again. Sellers' failure to capture the heart of Loren is said to have kick-started his infamous personal problems, which dogged him for the rest of his short life. Also deleted by 1963 was Bruce Forsyth's Mr. Entertainment, which turned out to be the late popular British entertainer's first and only LP for Parlophone. Bruce always fancied himself as the British Sammy Davis Jr., but although highly talented as a light entertainer, he never quite reached Sammy's heights. PCS 301-4 is unfortunately missing from my collection, as it's the rarest of all these early albums. It was the one and only solo LP by talented British songwriter Jerry Loren, who, amongst other things, wrote Apache and Wonderful Land for the Shadows. Its early deletion and poor sales make it virtually impossible to find in stereo today, unless of course you're prepared to pay north of £100 for a copy. Scotland is a place you are never far away from in Parlophone land, and PCS 3015 from 1961 brought us Blue Bonnets Over the Border, as performed by the pipes and drums of the King's own Scottish Borderers. Another one for Granny, I think. Pepe Yaramillo makes another appearance on PCS 3017, with more of his romantic American rhythms, this time accompanied by Jeff Love. PCS 3018 is a British comedy classic. As a counterpoint to Sellers' nuance-laden, carefully sculptured comedy language, here's tortured genius Spike Milligan's manic, all-shouting, all-screaming brand of comedy inside one of the most striking of all the Parlophone covers. Even the rear panel with its Arabic script just shows how far ahead of the others he was. I can't and won't attempt to describe this album, but just recommend you give it a listen for yourself. Normal service is resumed with Ron Goodwin's Serenade on PCS 3019, with 12 lush and sweeping serenades from his 36-piece concert orchestra. Again, Ron's cover is outstanding, and I really love this one. PCS 3020 was not Matt Monro's first album. That had been a rather low-key Decca 10-inch release in 1957. But Love Is the Same Anywhere was his first for Parlophone. Produced by George Martin and engineered by his favourite engineer, Stuart Eltham, this lush-sounding, well-recorded LP followed up his big single successes Portrait of My Love and the swingy My Kind of Girl. More Matt later. Traditional jazz was the theme again on PCS 3021. This time it was the Temperance Seven, a band of ex-Chelsea School art students who went around pretending it was 1904 and achieved national fame by having a #1 hit single called You're Driving Me Crazy, which was also produced by George Martin. This album was more of the same, but this really was the last gasp of this style of music before the Beatles took over. Blue Horizons on PCS 3022 were billed as 12 titles for the nostalgic traveller. Alan Ainsworth was your guide this time on trips to places such as Santa Lucia, Portofino, Hawaii, Sorrento, the Isle of Capri, etc., in the days when these places really were still exotic. Another early deletion was PCS 3023, which starred 13-year-old twins Elaine and Derek Thompson. Together, they chirped their way through 12 religious-flavoured songs, making this album another worthy candidate as a gift for mum or granny. Derek Thompson went on to become a famous actor in the UK, and is best known as his role as Charlie Fairhead in the long-running BBC television hospital drama Casualty. Talented Scottish musician Joe Piano Henderson, already well known for his relationship with the young Petula Clark, made his Parlophone debut on PCS 3024, and was in nostalgic mood with 14 well-loved evergreens, ably supported by Jeff Love and his orchestra. Adam Faith returned on PCS 3025 with more of the same fluff, but it's one of the albums which took me the longest to find on this label in stereo. The bestiary of Flanders and Swann follows up from the success of the Hippopotamus song on their first album, and here all of the songs are humorous ditties in the same style about animals of all shapes and sizes. As 1962 begun, the Glasgow Phoenix Choir returned once more for PCS 3027 for Songs We Love, with more wistful Scottish folk songs. PCS 3028 saw Ron Goodwin on his travels again, this time to Beirut. Not a city which immediately springs to mind as being a premium destination, as for several decades it conjured up images of devastation and danger. However, before that, a sudden influx of foreign money in the 1950s led it to becoming a playground for the world's most affluent tourists. The sleeve notes make the claim that thousands of copies of his LP which we looked at earlier, Music for an Arabian Night, was sold in Lebanon. Unlikely, but who knows? Unfortunately, I'm missing PCS 3029 At Home with Bridie Gallagher, but here's a picture of it. PCS 3030, like some of the other LPs we've already seen in this series, harks back to the olden days, the Roaring Twenties in fact. Here, Parlophone stalwart Mrs. Mills bangs away on her specially prepared piano to all the hits of the days gone by, which interestingly includes The Sheik of Araby, a number the Beatles played on their Decca audition. I don't remember them ever citing Mrs. Mills as an influence, but you never know. Co-founder of the Goons, Michael Bentine, shows up on PCS 3031 with It's a Square World, which was the title of his BBC television series which ran from 1960 to 1964. It was a sketch show of madcap sketches featuring special effects and miniature models, and was written by Bentine himself, for which he also won a Golden Rose of Monro award in 1963. It's a great sounding record, once again engineered by Stuart Eltham, and you've got to wonder what the Beatles would have sounded like if he'd been at the controls for Please Please Me. Joe Henderson returned for PCS 3032 without his piano but with the Williams singers and a sing-along from the shows. This was deleted very quickly and is very hard to find. Pepe Yaramillo takes a collection of Broadway show songs and again adds his own Mexican flavour on PCS 3033. Entitled A Mexican on Broadway, it's as simple as that. PCS 3034 sees Matt Monro singing Hoagie Carmichael on one of my favourites in this catalogue. A masterfully recorded and pressed album, and look at that front cover. Matt was so cool. Also singing Hoagie Carmichael on this album, a combination of Cribbins, but not looking so cool, is well-loved British comedy actor Bernard Cribbins on the front of PCS 3035. Bernard had a couple of big hits in 1962, Hole in the Ground and Right Said Fred, which were both masterful George Martin productions, full of innovative sound effects, which will stand him in good stead for his future work with the Beatles. I also found this mono copy of the same album on EMI's Export Odeon label, which, as you might be able to see, has just been pasted over the original Parlophone label. Beatles collectors will also recognise this as being the same label used for the ultra-rare UK export edition of Yellow Submarine in 1969. PCS 3036 was another British comedy classic, Bridge on the River Wye. This was written by Miligan as a parody of the film The Bridge on the River Kwai, and based on an earlier Goon Show episode called African Incident. Here, Miligan and Sellers were joined by Peter Cook and Jonathan Miller. Legend has it that the distributors of the film threatened an injunction if the full name was used, making George Martin edit the letter K out of every word, thus creating Bridge on the River Wye. The exotic-sounding Music for Late Night Latins by Francisco Chavez and his orchestra is one I used to have, but I sold it to a man who convinced me he couldn't live without it, and I've yet to replace it. PCS 3038 was Adam Faith's final gold label LP for Parlophone, and like his others, it was not a big seller in stereo. However, the label on this copy does show the same label characteristics of the newer EMI presses, which were soon to be used to produce Please Please Me. That Was the Week That Was British television's first satirical comedy show, and is culturally significant for it marked a real shift in attitudes towards the establishment. Headed by David Frost, this group of performers were to comedy what the Beatles were to music. Although it's not a surprise the show was released on LP, it is unusual that it was deemed important enough for stereo. So, the stage was set for you-know-who. But just before that tsunami hit, William Clausen pulled us back from the edge with Songs of the Sea on PCS 3041. Clausen, along with Gunnar Hahn and his orchestra and chorus, entertained you with Norwegian sailor songs of old, which, it says here, are performed with wit and relish to tasteful accompaniments which never overdress the sublime simple melodies. A few weeks later, it was followed by PCS 3042, and things would never be the same again.